Hello.
Yeah. How are you doing? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. Hope you
Yeah.
had a wonderful holiday season. We're scant on time, so I say you hit me with it. Blow my brain open. What do you got?
Okay. Well, so I mean, I would like to start with a little bit of a recap and a little bit of a reconsideration of the stuff that we said last time, so that we can make sense of whether we are in the same ground or not. And also, I want to see if you are adopting these theories that I'm presenting to you, and if you are finding them useful at all. So let's start with one of the main questions that we had last time. By the way, I cannot see you.
All right, here. Hello.
Hi. It makes it easier for me to talk if I'm talking to like your video and not to mine alone. So okay. So I mean, I was just saying that one of the main themes that we covered last time that I think was really I think it's a really important question to answer is, why is it important? Everything that I said last time, okay, we talked about the labor theory of value, the theory of exploitation, and you asked the question, why is this important? Okay, what is the use in all of these things, and what can we do with it? And I want to retake this specific question, okay, so that we can provide more insights into it. So the first thing is that, okay, I believe that we should take this because it is, for me, more accurate in scientific terms, okay? The framework that I laid out to you last time, which is the classical and Marxist economic school framework, this framework, I believe, it's more scientifically accurate than pretty much all other schools out there. It doesn't mean that it has all the answers to everything. It doesn't mean that all other schools don't have valuable insights. They do. And actually, some of the insights that we take in the modern developments of the classical Marxist school are taken from different schools as well, okay? From Keynes, many insights are taken from there. And but I do nevertheless believe that this is more scientifically accurate, okay? And not only that, but I believe this is really useful because it provides us, okay, and this is the main theme that I tried to touch on last time, that it provides us with a radical understanding of the types of societies that we live in, okay, that goes to the root of the functioning of these societies in order to give us adequate descriptions of the symptoms of some of the problems that we suffer in these societies and that we want to get rid of. I don't know if you're in agreement with what I've been saying so far.
No, well, I mean, I don't remember all of the precepts necessarily with this this framework for analysis. I remember agreeing with you on some of the stuff, but I don't know if I ever got fully moved over on the idea of like there being a predictive value or a necessary utility when it comes to the labor theory of value and the relationship between price and value. I mean, I understand the analytic value. I know it's useful to talk about in some instances. I don't know when you would necessarily apply it, like what problems you would look to solve by using it.
Okay, so very important, because this is exactly what I wanted to get to. So why don't I first, finish this answer, okay, to the why it is important, and then we can get on that detail so that I can fully outline to you the argument so that you can see it and judge it on those grounds and see if it is something that you want to adopt or not. Because last time we got to touch on the basic description of the theory, but we never really got to a full defense of it, okay, both theoretical and empirical. So let me just say that when I mean a radical understanding of these societies, what I mean is an understanding, okay, that is not based on the surface level of these societies. Okay, we don't just focus on what we see immediately in front of us. We try to go to the inner mechanisms, to the inner processes that make these societies function and that make them viable and that make them exist in reality, right? And this is important because if you focus only on the surface, which I believe a lot of schools do, or at least that is the main theme of a lot of schools, And here I can actually, make specific contrasts of the school of thought that I believe in with the neoclassical and with even some heterodox schools that I don't subscribe to. But if we don't look to those specific questions and if we don't give answers like the ones that we give, we are going to be led to a poor understanding of our societies, and therefore we're going to be led to poor policy decisions and to poor political takes. Okay, and just to make it clear, one of the main things that I think it's really important to understand in our school is that we view capitalism not from an ideal standpoint. We don't start from the world of perfection, of perfect competition, from the world of hyper rational agents that are all knowing, that maximize their utilities, which is what happens in neoclassical economics. We start from what we can see immediately in front of us, and we try to give, as I was saying, those internal explanations. And this makes our approach, better at understanding the conflicts and the crises that we see in reality. Because if you start from the premise that, like neoclassical economics do, that there is this thing called perfect competition where firms are passive, they are price takers, where consumers are maximizing their utility, and where Pareto optimal solutions are achieved, then there doesn't seem to be any conflict there. You're just working at the level of exchange, and everyone seems to be better off. And therefore, your policy solution is we need more markets, not less. And we need more entrepreneurs and more profit-driven investments and all of that. And we need less of other things. That is immediately going to be the answer, right? And when you're asked, well, then how can you explain unemployment? Because neoclassical economics, at the level of perfect competition and that, they don't have an understanding of unemployment. Then the thing is, the problem is the world. The problem is that we have, in the real world, there's something wrong, and we need to make it so that we get this perfect capitalism, right? Our understanding immediately contradicts that entire framework and says, no, the world is what it is. So we cannot judge the world based on a perfect version of the world. We have to judge it on its own terms. And if we look at those terms, we will see a completely different picture. Do you see where I'm going?
No, I fully agree. I am not at all under the impression that sort of like perfect sphereless cow in a vacuum neoliberal approach to economic analysis is effective, but that doesn't speak to what was said earlier. When would you bust out the labor theory of value to solve a problem? When would you use it to address or understand a situation that you couldn't through I don't know. Well, for instance, like it's not as though economists operate under this aforementioned sphereless or spherical cow in a vacuum system when they analyze economic problems either. Most economists, have updated the framework to the point that they're capable of acknowledging externalities and supply failures and the like, and other stuff that isn't a part of sort of like archetypal laissez-faire capitalist theory. When would the utility of this theory be most evident?
First of all, take into consideration the fact that those things that you're saying are, the improvements that are made and so on and so forth. Those are like departures from the starting point of the ideal, right? And those departures are, in my opinion, flawed from the very beginning, because they keep as a point of reference that ideal, right? And actually, if for anyone that has studied economics at an undergraduate and at a graduate level, you will see that most of what you cover is the idealized version of capitalism, and then only in the end, and you can see this, you don't even need to go to university to check this for yourself. Just look at the textbooks, at the introduction, intermediate, and advanced textbooks, and what you will see is that the entire theory of perfect competition, of perfect capitalism, is built and presented as if that is how the world actually works. And then only in the end, on the last chapters, you see externalities, monopoly, and all of that. But that's a problem also. The problem is that when you view capitalism as that perfect system, then you see the world as an imperfect version of that. You know what I mean? There's no imperfections without a perfect point of reference, without a perfect version of that imperfect model. And what this means, okay, is that you are tied all the time to that version. What we need in order to have a radical understanding, and let me show you how this applies, okay, to concrete theoretical and policy things. Okay, let me show you first. But the main insight, okay, here is that if you tie yourself constantly to that perfect vision, you are not being really revolutionary. Okay, revolution. So, in philosophical terms, what being a revolutionary really means, okay, is not changing the details in the surface of an already built system. Is bringing about something that doesn't allow you to view the system as you did before. That is what a revolutionary thinker, what a revolutionary proposal really does, right? It goes beyond that framework to the point where you can no longer come back. Do you agree with that? At least in the principle of that.
I'm not really sure. I think it's possible to keep the same framework while radically reshuffling the descriptive terms within it. I don't know if you would need to like it depending on the principles by which you sort of like build these systems. The difference between the way in which you choose to analyze it, I don't know how much that necessarily reflects on the on how radical or how transformative that system is. I mean, my goal isn't to be radically to be economically radical, right? That's just kind of like a second order thing from the goal of being economically democratic. If it turned out that economic democracy could function well within systems that are already kind of like an understood paradigm, like economic frameworks that are already generally accepted, that would actually make things a lot easier, because it means that you could achieve those democratic pathways for our economy without needing to like reinvent the wheel. So, which is why I'm always kind of tentative when it comes to alternate models for understanding these systems, because it's one thing with political theory, rebuilding the economy from the ground up is a pretty mighty task, and I would really need to know like what value you gain from the LTV theory that would make it worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, it's not just the LTV, okay? The LTV is one of the foundational blocks of a more complex system, okay? So it's not, everything doesn't get reduced to that, but it's nevertheless an important thing. So and we are gonna go over that. But the thing is, let me show you one example where this point that I was making becomes concrete, okay? So take an actual Marxist, okay? Take a Marxist like Richard Wolff, okay, which you probably know.
Yeah, of course.
So he belongs to a strand of Marxism, okay, and he's like oscillating back and forth. I don't think he really has a really concrete standing on this point, but at least from what he says, okay, publicly and in debates and in his lessons, you can see him defending a version of Marxism that is what I like to call like monopoly Marxism, okay, which is actually something that was extended and was something that was really popularized by Lenin himself. So this is not something that is like in some like corner. This is like central to a lot of Marxist theories today, and this is something that I am antithetic, so that I don't believe is the case. So this version of capitalism starts, okay, takes as a point of reference, whether consciously or not, the perfect version of capitalism that I was talking about. But it says, okay, yes, it gives the argument to the neoclassicals. It tells them, yes, maybe you are correct about all of these things about perfect competition and all that, but you know what the problem is? The problem is that in reality, capitalism is imperfect. And capitalism gives rise to monopolies. And monopolies are really what control the underlying troublesome social phenomena that we observe and that we suffer. One of these examples is inflation. What is Richard Wolff's position on inflation? What did he say is the cause of inflation? I mean, he didn't give a really concrete answer, but when he was speaking about inflation, he actually made the argument, and I actually made a couple of videos criticizing this, that inflation was caused because there's like this extended, sort of like cabal of monopolies that rule capitalism, and that they decided to make prices higher. So this is an answer to a problem, to a symptom, okay, that is then the answer. Okay, so the answer is then, how can we correct this? And Richard Wolff here could easily be in agreement with a neoclassical economist saying, okay, well, if the problem is monopoly, then let's regulate against monopolies. And then Richard Wolff would say, no, because capitalism naturally produces monopolies. But again, if capitalism naturally produces monopolies, you can always go back to the question of, well, I mean, we just need to produce the right legislation to avoid this from happening, right? So it doesn't move beyond capitalism. It's just saying, well, I mean, there's this thing called monopolies, which are really the problem. But if you take away monopolies, everything else remains the same.
Yeah, I agree with that. But again, I need a better solution then. If that's the issue, I could accept that flawed answer. If somebody said to me, and they could tell me, they could bring out these graphs and numbers, and they could say, okay, according to the economic models we're familiar with, this is about as good as it gets. Monopolies will always be an issue under any kind of economic system, whether it be market or command. But the best thing you can do is have a robust set of like legal rules that prevent them from forming. It's not perfect. It's always going to be like a kind of internal competition thing. There will always be a danger of the laws failing or of them going overboard, but that's the best we could do. If somebody told me that, I wouldn't necessarily disbelieve that. And I would need a lot of convincing that there was any, like, I guess utopian is the wrong word, but it feels like almost idyllic that you could construct a system that would not naturally contain the antagonisms that create the problems within capitalism. Maybe you can alleviate some, but I feel like there will always be a good number present.
Of course, there's always going to be problems to deal with, but I'm at an earlier stage than that. Okay, I'm not proposing yet a solution to these problems. I'm proposing a theoretical framework that allows us to diagnose properly the problems, because a part of what, curing an illness, a big part of what that means is properly identifying that illness, right? And if your theory so there's an illness, inflation, which reduces the purchasing power of households, which is a problem because then their welfare is diminished. So that is the problem. Now, what is our identification of the causes of that problem? Well, if you ask a Marxist that belongs to this tradition of monopoly Marxism, then they would tell you, well, the problem is monopolies. But that doesn't stop a neoclassical from saying, well, if the problem is monopolies, let's just regulate against monopolies and keep the capitalist system as it is, right? Let's get to more capitalism. In fact, some of them would say, yes, monopolies are caused because of the state. And then you get to anarcho-capitalism, right? So this is really the key thing. Now, my theory proposes that inflation is not actually caused by this like detail in the surface of capitalism, these monopolies, which actually the empirical evidence doesn't agree with this type of thinking, right? There's a lot of theories on administered prices and all of that, which are by the data, okay, shown not to be accurate reflectors of the real world. Okay, so monopolies don't actually have the power that a lot of these people say that they have, and actually they don't have the power to produce inflation at the macroeconomy, right? So this is, from my standpoint and from the empirical evidence, ludicrous. Okay, you cannot really say that this is the case. So then the question is, what is a better diagnose of the problem? And this is the one that I provide with the framework of the classical Marxist political economy, which one of the building blocks of which is the labor theory of value. And how do you get from the labor theory of value to inflation? Well, I mean, theoretically, that's a really, I mean, you can write thousands of pages, okay, on this link, okay, but I need you first to understand that this is what I'm trying to do, right?
No, I understand that, but don't you feel that existing models do a fairly decent job of explaining why we experience inflation? Obviously, they don't have flawless predictive power. No one can see the future, but I feel like the system that we live in is fairly well accounted for by the analysts we live with. that's not to say that mistakes aren't made, but even if you take stuff like the 2008 housing crisis, right? It's not as though economists weren't pointing out that this was an issue. It's just that they don't have the power to snap their fingers and prevent all the subprime mortgage loans from taking place.
Exactly. Many didn't see this problem actually, and there are many books that have been written by orthodox economists. You don't even need to go to the heterodox ones. Many books from the orthodox economists admitting that most of them weren't seeing this coming because they were working on assumptions, they were working on models that didn't take into account the details that other economists were taking into account. But I'm not
But
saying
we
that
can
there are
account
no.
for it in our system, right? Like right
But
now,
what
you
is
could
your
ask.
system? This is the thing.
Well, I guess like when I say our
Because you're
system,
talking with you're talking with a person that knows what the different schools of economic thinking say about these types of things, that works in a bank where a lot of forecasts are done on many things, and that actually understands how these models are built and how they're used. So I need you to give me like, where exactly do you think that the answer is? Because there's this thing that I really don't like that a lot of people do, is they point to this concept of modern economics, and this is like a really abstract concept that doesn't encompass any specific things. It's just like, well, modern economists understand this and that, but which economists? Because economics, as I was saying the other day, is not a soft science, and there's no consensus on pretty much anything.
yeah, I don't think there can be a consensus. But these are systems and problems that can be understood within, I guess, a neoclassical framework. Or to say there are non-Marxist economists who can talk about inflation and the
Yeah,
housing crisis and what caused these issues. I don't know
of course.
exactly what subsets of which economic theories would be best at approaching them, but it seems like there is a lot of descriptive utility within the systems we already have. When I talk about stuff like this, I come at it from a sociological lens, which is to say, I don't think of these lens as themselves containing like information or truth, more so that they're frameworks that you choose to adopt to give you more insight on an existing set of like descriptive factors. So, like from the sociological lens, right, you have like critical theory and you have structural functionalist theory, and you can make a choice to look at something from either of those angles. The angles themselves don't contain the information. They just give you hints on how to interpret the information that already exists in the subject you're looking at. And that's the way I think of econ theories. I don't think that any economic theory itself necessarily has like information within it that is sort of descriptively valuable. There's just differences in how much utility you get out of applying those theories when looking at the real world and the real economic problems we face. And that's what I want to know, because as somebody who does arguments a lot, like in what situations could I say, okay, well, the current economic paradigm cannot account for this. Like if I were to go to a regular economist, I guess any non-Marxist, and ask them about this or talk with them, they could not give me an answer. You need to turn to something else. There's a gap here that needs to be filled with another interpretive lens. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I would say that it's not just about giving an answer, because anybody can give an answer to anything, right? This is what religious people have been doing for the entire history. They have been given an answer to everything that we don't know by saying it's God that did it, right? So, but the fact that they gave an answer doesn't mean that the answer is as valid as every other answer. There are ways in which we can discriminate between answers to discern which ones are better. And what I'm saying is that I believe that my school of economic thinking provides better answers, not necessarily to everything, okay? And I'm not saying that all other schools are completely clueless, because that is absolutely not what I'm saying, and something that I haven't said at all throughout my academic career. But what I mean to say is that if we look, okay, at these questions from our lens, I believe that we can get more analytical depth, and that we can devise theories that have a predictive power and that actually are better descriptors of the world. Okay, and one of the issues that I was talking about was precisely the issue of inflation in this case. But we don't even need to go to inflation. The other day I talked about unemployment, and I also talked about recurrent crises. And one of the main things that we can explain in a very natural and in a very satisfactory fashion, which other schools cannot, is the source of aggregate profits, right? which is important because aggregate profits are what drive capitalist economies. Profitability is what drives capitalist economies. And nevertheless, many schools don't even deal with what is the source of aggregate profits. In neoclassical economics, aggregate profits are treated as something that, it's like sometimes it's assumed that it's there, that firms, when they earn profit, it's like they deserve that profit somehow. And in other instances, they make this distinction between accounting and economic profits. And they say, okay, in a model where there is constant returns to scale, okay, and there is perfect competition, and there is a well-behaved production function, in that particular environment, you will have zero economic profits. So in that particular environment, economic profits should be zero. So there's no economic profits. But the Marxists come and say, let's assume, okay, for a second, a lot of the things that are assumed in a more capitalism-friendly framework, okay? Let's assume that commodities exchange at their values. First of all, there's no unequal exchange. Let's assume, okay, that people trade voluntarily and they make trades so that they can actually obtain more utility from the things that they are purchasing than than what they had before. Okay, let's assume this environment. Okay, and let's even assume you don't even need to assume perfect competition. You just need to assume what we call real competition. Okay, which is how competition actually works. Let's assume all of these things. Even in that world, okay, even in that world, you can still find an explanation for why there must be a material basis to monetary profits, which is surplus labor, which is surplus value. And this, okay, is something that is naturally drawn from our framework, and other frameworks completely ignore the question or immediately just build the system in such a way that there cannot be profits. That profits is like an anomaly. And if profits are found in the real world, then that is because the world is imperfect.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, it seems like anytime you try to construct an economic theory that has a mathematically precise equation for determining economic outcomes, you're going to run into trouble because there's always kind of friction at the ends. I mean, I know, at least from arguing with enough libertarians, that sort of like Econ 101 perspective on how the world works is usually really, really flawed. But I don't know where I would make that jump. I mean, you've said yourself that you could write 1,000 pages on tying together the LTV and inflation rates, you know? I could never read those 1,000 pages and then regurgitate them in the context of a disagreement that I'm having with some capitalist or whatever. I would need to, when could I pull that out? You know?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
when could, not to sort of cheapen the value of this information with my with my predilections, but when could I epically own someone with a realization or like a showcase of their ignorance, because they don't understand these theories?
I mean, your question is completely valid. So and actually, your question is really what Marx, in my opinion, failed to do in Capital, right? And his purpose was to write a book, okay, that was going to explain everything, and that was going to be so radical, and that was going to be so politically powerful that when the people read it, they would immediately see the problem with capitalist societies, and they will immediately produce a revolution. Right? This was like the task. Writing something that would immediately, when people read it, click in them and would say, yes, we need a revolution. What's the problem? That what he wrote was very far from that. Now, it's beautiful writing, don't get me wrong, okay, especially volume 1, because it's the only one that he actually got to publish himself. Okay, it's beautifully written, and it has a lot of references, and it has, a very detailed explanations of countless economic phenomena that still apply to this day. But nevertheless, it is unintelligible to anybody that doesn't have, the kind of education that Marx had, which is a very privileged education. So your question is really important, and it is something that let me see if that I've been thinking a lot. Okay, how we can do this, and my videos, a lot of the times I go into very very minute details, which can turn our attention away the main picture, okay, the big picture. But what I want to do, so something that I really work to do is exactly to be able to do exactly what you are asking me to do. So let's see if I can do it here. Okay, so you're in a debate, okay, and you're talking about inflation.
Mhm.
And somebody says, okay, the typical thing, okay, well, inflation is just, I mean, you don't even need to go to like the Richard Wolff answer, okay, let's just go to like a very common argument that you hear from the right a lot, right? Inflation is caused by states printing money. The problem is that states print money, and because, okay, there's this thing called the quantity theory of money. If you print money beyond the amount of goods and services, so beyond what is needed, okay, to exchange a certain amount of goods and services at a certain velocity of money, then you're going to get inflation, right? There's an equation that nobody actually disputes. Marx accepts this equation that is in this. Only the thing is that he reverses, in a sense, the causality. And let me explain why. But the main thing is, the right-wing argument normally is the problem is the state, right? And what we need to do is not print money. And then you have, okay, a Keynesian answer, which is, well, yes. The Keynesian answer is, I mean, yes, you can get inflation if you print money, but only if you are working at a level of output that is at full employment, right? So the argument is, you can always stimulate the economy by printing more money, so long as you don't get to full employment. Because the moment you get to full employment, if you stimulate the economy more by printing more money, then you're going to get inflation. What the neoclassical argument does, okay, in Friedman, for example, which is the theoretical reference of all of these people, what Friedman does is he assumes that capitalist economies always operate at the level of output that is at full employment. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, and that's obviously incorrect. Whatever conclusion you have to come to with inflation seems to be the default state of all economies at all times, with rare exceptions. Like deflationary economies are really, really, really uncommon. That seems to be like a really niche thing. And governments always have to print money because, if nothing else, they have to replace damaged currency in the market. Also, the population increases, usually, with time, and you have to accommodate that as well. And the government needs to print money because that kind of like lubricates the gears and cogs and wheels of the systems of distribution they have for that cash, and their ability to make loans, blah blah blah. So whatever argument you'd have to make about inflation, it would have to arrive at the conclusion that it's kind of like the natural outcome of a modern functioning economy, because otherwise you couldn't explain the fact that seems to be what's happening 99% of the time.
Exactly.
Right, yeah, so that outcome can't be correct. The idea that
But notice that this is with modern fiat currency, right? Because before we had the golden standard,
yes,
with the gold standard,
right.
there wasn't this massive inflation that we see today. Actually, if you look at the data on inflation, it's like very constant. And then at some point, wow, you have a level shift. But actually, not even a level shift. It just goes up exponentially.
What was
specifically at that time? So you need a theory of inflation with modern fiat currency.
Yeah, okay, before we went on the gold standard, hold on. If I Google average inflation rate for the past 100 years, I get from 1960 to 2021. Obviously, they're not counting before fiat currency. I don't know what inflation was like before then. Inflation during gold. I actually have no idea. I have no idea.
I can actually. I could pull out the graph for that you want to look at. The problem is that
you don't need to. I got it. Holy shit! Between 1880 and 1914, the period when the U.S. was on the classical gold standard, inflation averaged 0.1% per year. Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's yeah. I mean, obviously, if you have like a sudden boom in the amount of gold in your economy, you would have an uptick. But that seems like a lot of stability, like by default. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Continue.
Yeah, so then we have two contending theories, right? In this regard, which is one that is the neoclassical that says, well, I mean, inflation shouldn't be the case. You shouldn't get inflation. The reason why you get inflation is because there is this thing called the state that is constantly printing money. Basically, that's the answer.
Yeah.
Right. And what is the solution? Well, I mean, the state doesn't have to print money, and that's it. And then comes the Keynesian, which at the time was a radical answer, but in my opinion, it's not really that radical, not that revolutionary of an answer, which is, okay, so the state can certainly produce inflation by printing money, but it can only do so if the economy is assumed to be at full employment. What if the economy is not assumed to be at full employment, which is what happens most of the time? Well, in that case, the government can stimulate the economy by printing money and not get inflation. And for a time, this was actually the policy. This was the policy.
Is that
and then
true?
They came with the
that's Keynesian, right? The idea that
yes,
the government...
that's the Keynesian. That's not my answer. Okay.
Okay, no, but that's right.
Answer.
That's what they thought. Yeah, where the government has a responsibility during economic downturns, which have lower employment, to stimulate the economy by printing and spending, because in doing so, the economic uptick compensates for the inflationary forces of printing a bunch of money, and it kind of works. I mean, it doesn't work perfectly, but it's something. You know, it's not like totally without value, I think.
Exactly. The problem is that it misses out on a key concept that is not missed in the classical and Marxian tradition, which is why the modern version of the classical and Marxist theories on inflation, the modern version of this, which is developed by Anwar Shaikh, okay, this version takes this into account, okay, when he talks about modern money. And there is a really good book that I always recommend, but it's a very technical book, okay, which is called Capitalism, Crisis, Conflict, Competition, Conflict, and Crisis. Okay, so capitalism, conflict, competition, and crisis, or in some order. That was published in 2016. Okay, and in this book, there is an entire description of all of these processes that I'm laying out. Okay, and one of the chapters is dedicated towards the theory of the modern classical and Marxian theory of inflation with the current version of fiat currency, right? And the key thing that is missed in the Keynesian tradition, at least in that version of the Keynesian tradition of Keynes and of the latter Keynesians, that is something that is then developed with the Phillips curve and all that. The key thing that is missed, that is added by this, is the role of profitability, as I was saying the other day, the role of profitability in the regulation of economic patterns. So let's remember, the Keynesian answer is, there is such thing as a full employment level of output, and once we reach that, if we keep printing money, then we get inflation. What is the problem? That this was met with empirical failure during the stagflation crisis, because you had unemployment, okay, rising at the same time as inflation was rising, which is something that was not predicted by this particular argument, by the Keynesian argument that was then, which Keynes was not, Keynes didn't propose the Phillips curve, okay, so this was proposed by a different economist, but nevertheless, he takes more or less the logic. And Anwar Shaikh, for example, argues that Keynes is moving more towards a different theory than the one that was later proposed as the Keynesian theory, but that is besides the point. The thing is that both of these schools, the Keynesian and the neoclassical, are working under this assumption of the perfect world where there is indeed full employment. This is what I was saying. They both take as a reference this world. One assumes that the real world is a good reflector. One says that yes, that the real world accurately reflects that ideal, so that the ideal is a good model of the real, and the other says, well, the real is not a very good model, but we can try to get the real closer to the ideal by doing this, by printing money. What does my theory, which you can formalize it with a lot of mathematics and certainly that is done in the book, okay, but we don't need to do that here. Let's just get like the insight. The insight is that the level of output at which, once you reach that level of output, if you print more money, you get inflation, is not determined by full employment, because full employment, as I was saying the other day, is an utopia. It's a utopia in capitalist societies. Full employment cannot exist because capitalist societies are characterized by this thing called persistent unemployment.
Yeah, they need frictional unemployment so that there's always the threat of death and starvation if you get fired from your job. If full employment exists, then there's no actual threat to losing your job.
Yes, and it's not just frictional unemployment, okay? It can be all types of unemployment. The thing is that capitalism always has unemployment. And it's always a combination of frictional, cyclical, and all types of and structural unemployment. So there are all types of unemployment, all of them are combined. Okay, but there's always unemployment. And this is a natural outcome of capitalism. It's not a deviation from some ideal world, it's how capitalist societies actually work. They naturally produce this because of the conflict that I was talking about the other day between capital and labor. Okay, which, by the way, you can also formalize and test empirically, right? And this is done also in the book. But the thing is, since we cannot get to this full employment level of output, this full employment level of output is not accurate. Okay, it's not something that you can actually reach. Then you need to tie inflation to some other level of output. And what is that? Okay, well, it is a level of output, okay, that is determined by the interaction between the profit rate, okay, and the what we call like the growth capacity utilization rate, or the growth utilization rate. Okay, so it has to be tied to like real phenomena that actually exist, and one of that is the growth of the actual amount of stuff and how you can actually use that in order to produce the physical quantity of output that is in that equation, and then to the profit rate, because as I was saying, the profit rate is what drives investment. So obviously, growth is going to be positively affected by higher profitability, but you also need to take into account, okay, the growth utilization rate, and you also need to take into account the constant fighting and crisis that is inherent to capitalist economies in the conflict of capital versus labor. And if you take all of these things into account, you tie, okay, the level of output once you reach it, you get, if you keep printing money, you get inflation, to a level of output that is determined by the insight by profitability.
Is there any data?
Simplified version.
Is there any data on the reliability of that model?
Indeed, there is data, and actually, what we can show is that we can explain modern, movements in inflation ever since the time we got the time we got the modern version of fiat currency with this theory. Okay, so in this book that I'm talking about, and in the tradition that I'm working with, every theory is always at least in principle. Okay, we always try to tie it to some empirical findings. Okay, we always try to give empirical evidence in its support, and this is why I always suggest that you go and read this particular book, because in this book it's like it's like the textbook where all of these things are gathered and where the empirical evidence is contrasted to the theoretical models. And what you can see is that the data is well described, okay, by this particular theory in all its complexity, okay, because what I gave you right now, it's the simplified, okay, non-formalized version of the argument.
Yeah.
And this is really the and so how can you use this in a debate?
That'd be my question. Yeah, like to what extent could we? So in terms of using like the profitability model as a way of gauging when the creation of more currency would cause inflation. Obviously, I would need to see like specific empirical data on the predictability of that model. But assuming, because I can't review charts right now, assuming that is the case, moving forward from that, like it would be, go back 2 years. In America, COVID, there was child tax credit and stimulus payments given for COVID. A lot of people say that those payments contributed to inflation. That we're having an inflation boom right now because we printed a lot of money and spent it on those payments. But if I were to argue with someone who believes we should never do government handouts. You know, okay, well, actually, this is how you can prevent inflation. You need to look at this, not that. You know, what would the counter argument be, or how could I put that to them? You know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so this is the key thing, which is that the answer, okay, as with my original proposal of a radical system of thought, may not necessarily be, okay, the answer that you are seeking may not necessarily lie within the context of capitalist societies. Because notice that what I'm saying is that economic growth is positively affected by profitability, right? So what this means is that one of the mechanisms by which you can reduce inflation is by increasing profitability. That way you increase output, and therefore the money that you print doesn't produce that inflation, according to the equation of the quantity theory of money. Right?
As long as it was
so then the answer
actually
valid. So then the answer is not. So this is the problem with moving from what we call positive economics to normative economics, right? This is the key problem, is that in order to get to the normative version of economics, you need to have a moral compass. You need to have a moral system of moral thought that can move you there. Okay, this is the classical distinction between descriptive and normative statements. Okay, we're not reinventing the wheel here. It's the same, but only applied to economics.
Right.
And the thing is, we just gave a description, okay, which is, okay, so inflation comes about from the augmentation of the money supply in excess from what will give you the level of output that is natural in an economy, given a certain profit rate and a certain growth utilization rate and all of that. Okay? And a certain division of labor and all of that. So then you have a description, but you don't necessarily have a moral answer to that, to the question of what should we do? Because if you ask me, what we should do is we should try to move to a system where this is not the case, where where we don't have to make this trade-off. Okay, oh, right, you want more economic growth, then increase profitability. And how can you increase profitability? Well, then diminish workers' rights, increase the intensity of the working day, increase the length of the working day, which is what many politicians today want to do. Mm-hmm. They want to get us back to a time where we were working more than 8 hours a day. And you see this like in people like Elon Musk, for example, praising Chinese workers for being very obedient and for working very long hours for very little pay. Exactly. So, but you know what? That is, if what you want to get rid of is inflation, that is a correct answer. But the thing is, in what terms do we want to get rid of inflation? What do we want to sacrifice? Because our answer is not going to be perfect.
Do we even want to get rid of inflation? Isn't this a small amount of it good?
Exactly. But but all of these questions are allowed by the framework that I was just proposing. Because if you work with a different framework, you don't even get to this level of detail in the moral questions that you can ask and the answers that you can give, right?
I guess, well,
because if you work,
it would hinge on the profitability model's predictive utility, I think. Because I feel like a lot of this stuff can have its bases covered by more hegemonically accepted economic theorists. I just don't know where the edge case would be that one is more. I mean, it would come down to like the predictive ability, I think. Unfortunately, stuff like that requires not only a familiarity with the data, but the ability to parse it, which might take a bit of legwork on my part. But if it can be useful in that respect. I mean, I'm still not entirely sure I even have a full understanding of what profitability means in the context of, this economic analytical structure. But if it could be understood and there was like a good like template you could use to epically own the capitalists in debate, then I think that's a good thing.
You can actually do that, and this is precisely why I wanted to talk to you, because you are a very vocal figure in the online left, and you are a person that does a lot of debates. And in many debates, economic questions rise. okay, because it's inevitable. And I think there's value, not in being an expert on these subjects, but at least in having an understanding of some of the nuances of these subjects in order to inform the positions that you take in those debates. Because if you are on the camp of Richard Wolff, then you go to a debate, which happened actually to Richard Wolff. In one of the videos that I made critiquing his position on this issue, I actually provided a clip where he was debating with this guy, which is like I never remember his name, okay, but he's one of these manosphere people that has that actually talked to Andrew Tate at least once, and who is that dresses very well and talks about how capitalism is very good and how you should be
Jordan Peterson?
Working very no, not Jordan Peterson. It's a different guy. I don't remember his name. I don't want to invent a name that I don't know. But in this debate, okay, he was debating a very famous pro-capitalist guy, Richard Wolff, and they were touching on this subject, okay, of inflation, of the loss of purchasing power by household, and so on and so forth. And Richard Wolff was giving his standard answer of, well, this is caused by monopolies who take, and you know what the guy said? And he was right. And this is the big issue that I have, that he was right. He said, of course not, it cannot be due to monopolies. Monopolies don't have that amount of power, because in capitalist economies, competition always ensures that whatever market barriers you produced for yourself will inevitably be eroded. And he was saying, for example, Amazon is scared, okay, of Walmart and of all other companies that are competing with Amazon. And if you read the business literature, if you study business, which a lot of the times business people have a better understanding of economics than economists, and this is why I'm doing an MBA, business people will always tell you this, that no matter how much you believe that you have created the right conditions for you to become like the monopolist of a given market, you are always under threat, because competition always, in the long run, ends up eroding this, especially in a world where monopolies and oligopolies and all that are so criminalized. Because, again, back in the day, it was believed that the problem was monopolies. And sure, monopolies give rise to a lot of troublesome phenomena. And so what happened, that then the legislation was adjusted to criminalize monopolies and collusion and all of these phenomena. And yes, you can say, well, it's not perfectly criminalized. There's still a lot of, legal niceties that you can employ in order to build these types of frameworks. But it is nevertheless not, in the long run especially, it's not a system that can work. Your business cannot remain a monopoly for long. And this especially doesn't apply to the broad economy.
Assuming, of course, that there are limitations on the extent to which these corporations can self-govern, right? If you had like a corporate town model, where you had a single business that monopolized vertically and controlled everything and then bought out the police and this and that, you could maybe maintain this forever. But even then, the monopoly is kind of a side problem, even within our system. Because the issue isn't whether the monopoly itself exists forever, it's whether the conditions of monopolization are inflicted on the consumer forever. Even if one monopoly is toppled every few years and replaced by another, that might represent tumult in the corporate sphere, but the effect on the consumer is that they remain under a monopoly. Maybe not always the same one, but a monopoly. Disney is at the top of the game right now in media. Maybe one day they get bought out or they collapse and get reassembled into some other, that's all very interesting to the people making money up top, but the effect downstream is that there's one company controlling what you experience and what you consume, no matter what that company actually is. And I think, the interchangeability of those companies is kind of like a recurring theme of monopoly. If you take a look at like, okay, well, we're the new bosses, don't expect much to change.
But this is another problem, a theoretical problem actually, which is that because in perfect competition, it is assumed that businesses are infinitesimally small, so much so that they cannot influence, and they are all the same, so much so that they cannot influence at all the conditions of the market, because in perfect competition prices are given, which gives rise to a contradiction, because if all businesses are all knowing and they all know that they are infinitesimally small, so individually they don't have a power, but they all know that they are all the same, then that doesn't stop them from collectively behaving in such a way that they do this particular thing of like jacking up prices or whatever. So this is like just like a theoretical contradiction in that particular version. But aside from that, the thing is, in the perfect competition model, businesses are infinitesimally small. So if you go to the world and you see that businesses are not infinitesimally small, which is not even well defined, what does it mean to be infinitesimally small? Okay, doesn't mean anything. But just assume, like, since businesses are not like that, then what you see is monopolies everywhere. You start to see monopolies everywhere. You start to see where market shares are more concentrated, you start to see monopolies. But one of the key insights of Marx and of the classical economists is that market concentration is not necessarily a good measure of the degree of monopolization, that's a mouthful, of a market. Because you can, even in a market, and these Austrian economists actually understand this very well. Okay, I had a course with a very famous Austrian economist in NYU called Mario Rizzo, who teaches many courses where he gives a very Austrian perspective, and he was making this argument precisely to argue against that kind of leftists, okay, like Richard Wolff, that say, well, because there's only two businesses, then that means that there's no competition. Well, Marx would very strongly disagree with that. Even in a market where there is a lot of market concentration, you still can have a lot of competition, and this goes back to the problem. Like, I work in a very large bank, and if like, people might say, well, this is a very established bank. Obviously, they don't have to worry. They can just set interest rates at whatever level they want. No, you know that the amount of resources that are from the bank itself invested on competing against our very big rivals as well, like Santander and that, immense amounts of investment are precisely directed, and a lot of the efforts that we as workers of the bank have to think about is, how can we compete? What do the customers want? How can we compete? So then the problem is clearly not there. It's clearly not in the monopoly, because in the concentration of market shares, the problem is in a different thing. But again, if you are a leftist and you want to criticize capitalist economies and you want to criticize them by the phenomena that we actually observe, but you take as a point, as I was saying at the beginning, you take as a point of reference the perfect ideal version of capitalism where businesses are infinitesimally small, then your only critique is going to be, well, businesses are not infinitesimally small, and therefore this is the reason why we have all of these problems. But if you take a radical approach, to a revolutionary approach to this question, you will get a different answer, which will be, yes, businesses are indeed very large, but that doesn't mean that there's no competition. And within the framework of real competition, of actual existing competition, we can still give answers to all of those questions that we ask ourselves. Why is there inflation? Why is there unemployment? And this is really the importance of the economic framework that I defend.
I think I'd have to do some reading on it. I think the issue so the problem here is that everything here is so well beyond the scope of the kinds of conversations that I have. I feel like I would need to how do you say it? To understand something might take a given amount of time. To understand something well enough that you can snappily iterate on that knowledge and talk about it in a casual setting. The knowledge to deliver information casually is more than the knowledge of the information itself. I think I would need to read up on stuff. Would you are there a couple of, not books, maybe articles that you could email me that I could use to sort of continue my education on this?
For sure. Actually, I can also email you if you are more interested in audiovisual content. I can also send you lectures by Anwar Shaikh and other different interviews and videos where you can find those points in a manner that you don't have to like read a very long paper or anything in order to get to that
jokes aside,
information.
I am a pretty fast reader, but either or works. In fact, I'd like
I
both.
can send you like all levels. I can send you like from huge economic manuscripts to short essays to videos, which are actually contain the same information but just delivered in different manners.
Yeah, I want to go over it. I think it could be useful. The econ stuff I've
and
always been
and
the weekest on.
and
But it
like
could be good to know.
one of the things that one of the approaches that I want to take here is I want to be like a, how can I help guy? Okay, if you are having trouble understanding something, okay, about the economy, or something that you think is related to the economy, and you want to get an answer that goes beyond, okay, just the perfect imperfect version of capitalism, and beyond like the very ideologically driven conversations that are just centered around, well, I mean, should we just like change this little thing here, and then this will make it work? If you want to get a better understanding, and like from what I believe is a better understanding, at least, you can always ask me. You can, or people that there are plenty of people out there that have these opinions that you can also ask. But at least I want to take that approach of how can I help? Okay, if you're struggling with a problem, and you think that it has to do with these types of questions, feel free always to let me know, and we can chat about it, and I can give you, because right now we just gave like an example of what an answer of the kind that I'm proposing would be in the case of inflation, right? This is just like a very minute example. What we could talk again. International trade. Why are there persistent trade imbalances between countries? This is a really important question for economic development, a very important question for understanding the dialectic of states, why states are in conflict with one another, and different economic theories have different answers. Some point all the blame to China because they have power to control certain economic variables. My answer is completely different from that. Doesn't give the blame to any given country, but rather gives the blame to a system and the internal functionings of that system. But we could also talk about economic crises. We could talk again profitability and many phenomena that are very useful in debates, okay, and that we can obviously within the scope of an hour not fully get a grasp at.
Yeah.
That's why I spent like years studying all these things.
I don't know if I have years to study it, but I definitely need to read up a little bit before I think I'm capable of parsing a lot of it.
Yeah,
No, I appreciate that very much. And I appreciated the conversation as well. It's not the type of content that I normally do, but that doesn't mean it's not valuable or interesting. Um, I need to spend some time thinking about it. It's easy to give, I guess, kind of like answers on the econ stuff within a hegemonic framework that like essentially like how do I take their logic but make it more progressive? But there are sort of like discursive limits to that. I guess like the
exactly.
closest comparison to like that I can think of would be with transgender people, where you can operate within like the binary model of gender in the West and be like, well, trans people are just born with the wrong brains and the wrong bodies. And you can get a bit of the right way with that. I mean, you can get closer towards equality with that than you could with a completely um trans exclusionary model, but it's not the same as like gender abolitionism or some kind of like radical model of re-understanding gender as a concept, which is more valuable in the
Yeah,
long run because that's sort of what you're gunning for anyway. I
yeah. Not only that, but actually, just to finish. Sorry that I interrupted you there. Eh, like if you start giving them, like the the framework of the conversation, if you give them that, then you're always working within that framework, and it's going to be very hard to move beyond that, right? If you accept the flawed premises of these people just to make your point, but in a manner that they can understand a little bit better, it's okay. Rhetorically it works, but it certainly is. I mean, they can even actually use it's a knife that I mean, it's a weapon of two sides. Okay, this is what we say in Spanish. That it's something that can be used in your favor, but also against you, and they can use it against you, right? And if you talk on this subject of transgender people, if you accept that binary and you say, well, it's just people that have a different brain than what their body and all of that. I mean, that's actually like inaccurate. It's not that they have a different brain than what their body. It's just that they have a different identity, which is not the same as saying a different brain, right? But if you start to like give in those types of accepting like the binary, for example, and all of that, then that is ultimately going to be used against you because they're gonna start asking questions that are
right, and there
that
there
you
are
don't
limits to the
really
paradigm, and once you run up against those, you have to concede points that you wouldn't have to otherwise, because there's a wall there that you can't get around. Um,
like.
yeah, okay. I look forward to seeing some of the stuff that you send me and getting a big brain that's very wet and moist, so I can think hard. I really do appreciate you coming on. Chat's been thirsting after your suit the entire time you've been here. Thank you always for your wonderful presentation. Could you shout yourself out as well?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Victor Magariño. I have well, I studied economics and philosophy at NYU, and I also have a master's degree in economics. I'm working toward an MBA. I am working at the behavioral economics department of one of the biggest banks in the world called BBVA, and I have a YouTube channel that where I precisely talk about all of these issues, looking at them from the Marxist classical perspective. And I also talk about other subjects, not necessarily directly related to economic questions, but that is primarily what I do. And I am very happy always to entertain any questions, any contentions with my claims, especially if they are honest contentions. And I really appreciate also having this talk with you. I think that it's really valuable to have these kinds of conversations, and I think that you have a very open mind, which is something that I very very much value. And just the fact that you asked me to provide you with further reading, that only that just like gives a strong impression of that of like intellectual honesty and willingness to
Don't give me
change
credit
your
yet.
mind.
Gotta
And
actually read it.
yeah. No, but like again, like if you have any contentions or anything, you can always come back to me and say, well, this thing that you said, I think it's incorrect. And I can be shown to be incorrect. And if you show that to me, I will immediately change my mind. So this is not just like me changing your mind or whatever. This is a reflective thing. Okay, you can always look at what I'm sending you, find problems within it, and come back to me and say, these are the problems. You know what I mean?
Okay. I'm going to learn enough so that I can epically own you in a debate. That's what I just heard you invite me to do, and that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just inviting you not to be close to that, which I think you're not, obviously.
Obviously. It's been a delight to talk to you again. I once again apologize for the enormously long wait in the first part of our conversation.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it was a good time for both of us to have more time to develop our thinking, ourselves also. I certainly grew a lot from the starting point of our initial
It was a while.
planning of the talk, and I'm certainly not offended or anything by it. I think it's completely natural, and I'm just really glad that we ended up having this conversation. So
it was a delight. Thank you again, and have a wonderful night.
yeah, for sure.
Take care.
Have a wonderful night.